In the 1970s, when New York was running on borrowed money and the streets looked worn from years of strain, most people crossed the Brooklyn Bridge without thinking about the work that kept the city alive. The sanitation routes, the market deliveries, the construction trucks, the wholesalers who supplied half the restaurants in Manhattan, all of it moved over the same arteries every day. And in a decade when the city was broke, understaffed, and stretched thin, the men who understood choke points understood opportunity. It was a time when cash moved faster than oversight, when a route mattered more than a badge, and when a few quiet hands could guide the flow without ever making the evening news. New York didn't look like it belonged to anybody, not officially, but the people who watched the trucks move at dawn, who stood near the approaches, who knew the rhythms of the bridge before most of the city woke up. They saw something different. They saw that every truck was moving money, and money that moves is money that can be touched. The men who ran certain parts of the city didn't need guns. They didn't need attention. They just needed the right crew at the right place, and a system that didn't raise its voice. If you love stories about power, control, corruption, and quiet empires built in plain sight, make sure to follow, because this one ends where nobody expected it to. New York City, 1973. The city was deep in financial trouble. Agencies were losing staff. Inspectors were stretched thin. The Department of Transportation had more paperwork than people. It was no secret. Everybody felt it. And when a system weakens, someone always fills the cracks. That's where the Genovese family came in, and that's where Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno made his move. Most people today remember Salerno for the later indictments, the cigar, the hat, the quiet booth in Harlem. But before all that, before the headlines, we built his reputation the way the old-timers respected, through steady work, smart business, and a sense of the streets. He wasn't a tough guy growing up. It wasn't flashy. As a kid in East Harlem, he swept floors in neighborhood shops, carried crates for produce sellers, and helped older men load trucks heading toward the markets. He learned the flow of goods before he ever learned the politics of the life. People who knew him back then always said the same thing. He understood how the city moved. By the early 70s, Salerno wasn't a kid anymore. He was a power inside the Genovese family, trusted for his judgment and his ability to make money without noise. His world was numbers, routes, supply chains, and steady income. And nothing in New York was steadier than trucks, especially the trucks that crossed the Brooklyn Bridge at sunrise every day. The opportunity wasn't dramatic. It didn't come from a feud. It didn't come from a threat. It came from something simple. The bridge approaches were choke points. Thousands of trucks moved over them daily, carrying produce from Brooklyn terminals, meat from the old warehouses, fish from the docks, building materials for the high-rise boom. If a man controlled who got priority, who got access, who didn't wait, he controlled time. And in trucking, time is money. It started quietly. A few men were stationed near the Manhattan side approach before dawn. They weren't wearing uniforms, they weren't yelling. They were just helping with the flow, as people put it back then. They waved certain trucks through first. They made sure certain wholesalers didn't get stuck in the morning grind. The drivers didn't complain. If anything, they liked the smooth passage, but the drivers knew what it meant. Nothing in the city moved that easily without somebody getting a taste. The system grew from there. Nobody used the word tax, not out loud. It was a fee, a courtesy, a favor. $10 to skip the line. $20 if you were late. More if your shipment had to reach a restaurant before opening. It wasn't written down. It wasn't on a sign. It was understood. And the drivers paid because they knew the alternative. Sit in traffic for an hour, watch the ice melt on your fish, or arrive late to a buyer who didn't tolerate delays. The men handling the collections weren't freelancers. They weren't small-timers. They answered directly to Salerno. They had rules. No shouting. No threats. No trouble with the cops. Everything quiet. Everything routine. They kept the envelope sealed and the route steady. The goal wasn't intimidation. The goal was efficiency. That's what made it powerful. Salerno didn't stand on the bridge. He didn't need to. He understood how to build a system that ran itself. He used the same logic the old market bosses used: control the flow, and you controlled the income. The Genovese family had already been tied into unions, wholesalers, and transport lines for years. This was just an extension, a natural step for a man who knew that the city ran on predictable movement. If you influenced the movement, you influenced the money. By the middle of the decade, the morning pattern was the same every day. A driver approached, gave a quiet nod to the man near the barricade, passed an envelope through the window, and rolled over the bridge without trouble. It didn't matter if he was hauling seafood, beef, produce, or construction supplies. The principle was the same. The bridge had become a gate, and gates have gatekeepers. Some drivers claimed the fee saved them hours a week. Some said they never questioned it. And some said they didn't like it, but paid because everyone else did. The wholesalers knew about it too. Many preferred it. Their products arrived faster, fresher, and without the usual city delays. People talk about corruption like it's always a fight. But the truth is, half the time the people paying are grateful for what they're getting. This wasn't a citywide secret. People in the trucking world talked. They knew who ran the flow. They knew whose name carried weight. And Salerno's name carried plenty. Not because he scared anyone, because he understood business and discipline. He kept the system predictable. The envelopes went up the line. The money reached the right hands. No shortfalls, no noise. That's why the family trusted him. By 1976, the quiet morning tax on the Brooklyn Bridge had become another piece of the city's machinery. Most New Yorkers had no idea it existed. They crossed the bridge on their way to work, listened to the radio, drank their coffee, and never realized that a silent economy was passing them on all sides. And the men collecting the envelopes never looked twice at the cars. They only watched the trucks. The system didn't grow because of fear. It grew because it worked. That was something Salerno understood better than most men in his world. A racket survives when the people inside it benefit from its existence. The truckers saved time. The wholesalers avoided delays. The markets opened with full inventory. And the men on the bridge turned a steady profit without ever raising their voices. In a decade when the city felt like it was falling apart, anything that moved smoothly felt like a blessing. And people don't question blessings. By the late 1970s, the morning flow wasn't just a pattern, it was a structure. The men handling the envelope pickup weren't random faces anymore. They were part of a rotation. They showed up at the same hour every day. They knew which drivers were regulars, which routes fed which markets, and which companies couldn't afford to fall behind. They carried themselves like attendants, not enforcers. That was the point. In a city where everyone was tired of being hassled, the quiet approach blended in. Salerno didn't change much. He didn't need to. He kept his distance. He let the line captains handle the daily rhythm. What mattered to him were the numbers, the steady, consistent numbers that came in at the end of every week. He had seen loud rackets fail when men got greedy. He had seen smart operations collapse because someone wanted to show off. He kept this one small on purpose. Not small in profit, small in exposure. People later said they never saw Salerno lose his temper. They said his strength was his calm. The older drivers remembered him long before the headlines. Back when he ran policy operations, back when he handled the numbers for Shylock routes. Back when his hands were full of the city's daily math, not the spotlight. What you saw in the 1970s was the result of 40 years of understanding how New York breathed. It wasn't only the truckers who felt the effect. The wholesalers across Manhattan, especially in the meat and produce districts, appreciated the smoother mornings. Their drivers had less downtime. Their shipments arrived earlier. They could schedule their buyers with fewer surprises. It's a few dollars a day to avoid the morning logjam. Most saw it as a cost of doing business. And many of them were tied into the same relationships anyway. The markets had long-standing connections to the same circles that ran gambling, loans, and trucking unions. Some say the operation expanded beyond the Brooklyn Bridge. Others say differently. Some drivers claim similar systems appeared on the Manhattan Bridge and at certain access points near the Williamsburg Bridge. But testimony from the era suggests that the Brooklyn Bridge approach was the most consistent, the most reliable, and the most profitable. There were mornings when the movement of trucks was as predictable as the tides. And the city, drowning in debt and manpower shortages, didn't have the tools to notice anything unusual. Bridge traffic was heavy everywhere. Lineups were normal. The men collecting envelopes weren't obstructing anything. They were speeding things up. If anything, the operation made the city look like it was functioning better than it actually was. The money didn't change hands in piles. It moved in small bills. 10s, 20s, a few envelopes from bigger wholesalers. And like most operations built on volume, the strength was repetition. A little from many beats, a lot from one. Every weekday morning brought a new wave. The system had no holidays. Markets never stopped. Trucks never slept. Quiet money is the hardest money to trace. That was the secret. The decline didn't come from the street. It came from Washington. By the end of the decade, federal attention on organized labor, trucking routes, and market influence was growing. RICO wasn't fully mature yet, but the groundwork was there. The Justice Department had begun looking at influence patterns across the city. They followed union ties, market relationships, and supply chains. And whenever they followed a supply chain in the 1970s, the trail almost always led to someone connected to the Genovese or Gambino families. Drivers started hearing rumors, investigators asking questions, audits being done on wholesalers. Federal agents watching the approaches to the markets. Nothing specific about the bridge at first, but the pressure was in the air. And in that line of work, pressure is a message. By 1978, some drivers changed their habits. A few avoided the early crossings. A few refused to pay the courtesy fee. Most still paid, but they watched the road behind them more often. When a racket relies on routine, disruptions, even minor ones, add up. Salerno read the signs early. He had spent a lifetime knowing when the wind was shifting. He didn't argue. He didn't force anything. He let the operation wind down the same way it built up quietly. A few collectors were reassigned. A few drivers were waved through without a conversation. The system didn't crash. It faded. That's how smart rackets end. The newspapers never printed a line about the envelope system on the Brooklyn Bridge. There were no arrests connected to it. No indictments listed it. No hearings uncovered it. But the people who lived in that world, the drivers who crossed before sunrise, the wholesale managers who depended on punctual routes, they remembered the years when crossing the bridge came with a small cost and a big convenience. By the early 1980s, the federal cases that shook the Genovese family changed the city. Surveillance increased. The unions came under heavy monitoring. New technology reduced the need for early morning choke points. And market routes were modernized. The quiet tax on the bridge didn't fit the new world. It belonged to a decade when the city was weak, and men like Salerno understood exactly how to fill the gaps. Salerno faced his own battles, later indictments, trials, headlines. But the older truckers, the ones who ran those routes at dawn, didn't talk about the courtrooms. They remembered the mornings when a man could pay $10 and gain an hour. When the bridge had a rhythm. When the city ran smoother, because a few men understood how to guide the flow. In the end, the Brooklyn Bridge stayed the same. The towers didn't move. The cables didn't shift. But the men who once shaped the morning traffic disappeared into the background. Part of a city that forgets things as quickly as it builds them.